There is a bone locked in the vaults of Egypt's Geological Museum in Cairo that is longer than a grown man is tall. One single bone. It came out of the sand less than a 2-hour drive from the Great Pyramid, and it belongs to an animal that was never supposed to be here. Not a lion, not a crocodile, not anything the pharaohs ever carved into a wall. It belongs to a creature the size of a passenger jet, a monster that walked this exact stretch of desert long before there was a single human being alive to see it. And here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. The stone the pyramids are built from is packed with the remains of ancient sea creatures. The ground under Giza is a graveyard, and the deeper you dig, the older and stranger the bones become. For 100 years, the official story was simple. Egypt is the land of the pharaohs. Tombs, gold, mummies, kings. Dinosaurs belonged somewhere else. In America, in Mongolia, in the Badlands of Argentina. Africa was supposed to be a blank space on the map, a place where almost nothing survived. But that blank space was a lie. Underneath the sand that surrounds the pyramids, scientists have pulled out the remains of some of the largest animals that ever lived on land. They found a coastline that no longer exists. They found forests turned to stone. And they found a mystery so strange that the man who first cracked it lost everything. His life's work burned to ash in a single night. The evidence gone before the world could see it. So today, we are going to do something that sounds impossible. We are going to trace the real creatures buried beneath and around Giza. We are going to decode the clues hidden in the very rock the pyramids are made of. We are going to follow the trail of a scientist whose greatest discovery was destroyed on purpose by war. And we are going to reach the one question that still has no clean answer. If the ground under the oldest wonder of the ancient world is filled with the bones of giants, how much of it have we actually uncovered, and how much is still down there in the dark, waiting? Let me start with the stone itself, because this is where it gets strange, and this is a clue you can see with your own eyes if you ever stand at the base of the Great Pyramid. The pyramids are not carved from ordinary rock. They are built almost entirely from limestone. And limestone is not a normal stone. It is made of bodies. Millions upon millions of tiny sea animals that died, sank, and compressed over unimaginable stretches of time. The specific limestone of the Giza Plateau is packed with a fossil so distinctive that tourists have been picking it up for thousands of years without knowing what it was. They look like little coins pressed into the rock. Flat, round, ridged discs. Some the size of a lentil, some as wide as a large coin. The Greek historian who visited Egypt in ancient times saw them scattered around the pyramids and wrote that they were the fossilized lentils left behind by the workers who built the monuments. He was wrong, but you can understand why he thought so. They really do look like food turned to stone. They are not lentils. They are the shells of a creature called nummulites, an ancient single-celled sea organism that lived in a warm, shallow ocean. Each little coin was once alive. And they are everywhere. The plateau is so saturated with them that geologists named the whole rock formation after them. Millions of them are pressed into the blocks that make up the pyramids, into the stone of the Sphinx, into the ground the whole complex sits on. When you look at a photograph of the Great Pyramid, you are looking at a structure assembled out of countless microscopic corpses, stacked into the most recognizable silhouette on Earth. And that is the first impossible fact. To build the pyramids, the ancient Egyptians quarried and stacked millions of tons of rock that was made entirely from the bodies of sea life. The most famous structure on dry land, in the middle of one of the driest deserts on Earth, is essentially a mountain of compressed ocean floor. The pharaohs were building with the dead. They just did not know it. Every time a visitor runs a hand across those ancient stones, they are touching an ocean that vanished before humanity existed. Most people walk right past it without a second thought. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And that ancient historian was not the only one fooled. For centuries, Travelers and scholars argued about those little stone coins, some insisting they were petrified food, some insisting they were natural stone. Almost none of them realizing they were staring at the fossilized remains of living things. The truth was hiding in plain sight on the most studied monument on Earth, and it took modern geology to finally read it correctly. The clue had been sitting on the surface the entire time. People just did not know how to see it. Now here is the mainstream explanation, and it is completely correct. Around 50 million years ago, this entire region was underwater. A warm tropical sea covered North Africa. When the sea life died, it settled into thick beds of limestone. Later, the sea retreated, the land rose, and much later human beings arrived and cut that fossil rock into blocks. Solid science, no mystery. Case closed. Except it is not closed, because the sea life in the pyramid stone is only the beginning. That limestone represents just one thin slice of time. Go deeper, go older, go into the layers of rock that sit beneath and beyond that shallow sea, and the fossils stop being tiny coins. They start being monsters. Because before this land was an ocean floor, it was a coastline. A green, wet, tropical coastline. And things walked on it. This is the part of the story that got buried, and I mean that almost literally. Because the man who first proved that giants once walked the ground near the Nile did not get a hero's welcome. He got erased. His name was Ernst Stromer. He was a German scientist, a baron by birth, stubborn, brilliant, and unlucky in almost every way a person can be unlucky. In 1911, he traveled into Egypt's western desert, into a low, blistering depression in the sand called the Bahariya Oasis, a couple 100 miles from Cairo. Everyone told him he was wasting his time. Egypt was for studying pharaohs and ancient mammals, not dinosaurs. Nobody believed there was anything down there. He started digging anyway. And in the bottom of that sunken desert basin, Stromer began pulling out bones that should not have existed. Not one new dinosaur. Four separate, enormous, previously unknown species, along with dozens of other creatures nobody had ever cataloged. He found a giant, long-necked plant eater. He found a monstrous meat eater. And then he found the one that would haunt paleontology for the next 100 years. A predator with long jaws, like a crocodile, and a row of tall, bony spines rising from its back like a sail. He named it the spine lizard. We know it today as Spinosaurus, and it may be the largest predatory dinosaur that ever lived, bigger than the tyrant king of the American West that everyone already feared. Sit with that for a moment. In the same country, in the same desert culture, famous for lions and jackals and crocodile gods, there were once hunters the size of buses with sails on their backs, wading through mangrove swamps where there is now nothing but sand. Stromer did not just find one strange bone. He found an entire lost world, a tropical coastline crawling with giants, preserved in rock, a 2-hour drive from where the pharaohs would later raise their pyramids. He shipped his discoveries back to a museum in Munich. He wrote careful papers about them. He built displays. And then, history did the cruelest thing imaginable. This is where it gets dark. The world went to war. Stromer, an aristocrat who refused to join the Nazi Party, watched his sons get sent to the front. 2 of them were killed. A third vanished into a prison camp for years. And Stromer, grieving and increasingly desperate, begged the museum's director to move his priceless fossils somewhere safe, out of the city, out of range. He knew what was coming. The director refused. He believed the Air Force would protect the city. He was wrong. On the night of April 24th, 1944, British bombers came over Munich. The museum took a direct hit. And in that fire, the only known skeleton of Spinosaurus, the giant sail-backed predator of Egypt, was destroyed. Not damaged, not scattered. Incinerated. Along with it, burned nearly all of Stromer's Egyptian dinosaurs, the long-necked giant, the great carnivores, the evidence of an entire lost coastline, gone in a single night. It was sealed in that museum. It was studied. And then it disappeared. All that survived were his drawings and his notes on paper. Think about what that means. For decades after the war, the biggest predatory dinosaur ever discovered existed only as sketches on a page. The bones that proved it was real were ash. An entire chapter of the ancient history of the land of the pyramids had been written and then burned before the world could read it. Stromer died a broken man, forgotten, remembered only for what he had lost. His giants slipped out of memory as completely as the sea that once covered Giza. For 50 years, that seemed like the end. The lost dinosaurs of Egypt were a ghost story paleontologists told each other. A tragedy. A dead end. And then someone went back. If you are still with me, if you want to see forgotten history like this pulled back out of the ground, subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of buried story this channel exists to dig up. And the next clue is bigger than anything Stromer ever found. Because in the year 2000, a young scientist from the University of Pennsylvania named Joshua Smith did something almost nobody thought was worth trying. He took Stromer's old notes, the ones that survived the fire, and he used them like a treasure map. He led a team back into that same brutal Bahariya Depression, into the same sinking desert basin, to see if anything was left after a century of silence. It was not easy, and it was not obvious. Stromer's notes were old, written in another era, describing landmarks in a desert that shifts and changes. The team spent weeks in punishing heat, walking the floor of that sunken basin, staring at the ground, finding scraps, finding fragments, wondering if the whole trip was a mistake. Nobody had recovered a dinosaur from this exact place in over 60 years. The last man to try had watched his life's work burn. There was every reason to believe the desert had nothing left to give. Then one of them spotted it, a piece of bone weathering out of the rock. He took a photograph. He marked the spot, and when the full team came back to excavate, they realized the scale of what was under the sand. What they found rewrote the record books. Sticking out of the ground was a single bone, an upper arm bone, the humerus, and it measured over 5.5 feet long, longer than any comparable bone from any known dinosaur of its age anywhere on Earth. It belonged to a creature so massive that when the team fully understood what they were looking at, they could barely believe it. A long-necked, four-legged colossus that may have weighed somewhere between 60 and 80 tons, as long as a blue whale. One of the most massive animals ever to walk on land, and it was standing right here, in Egypt, near the Nile, in what is now some of the emptiest desert on the planet. They named it Paralititan. The name means tidal giant, and that name is the second clue, because it is not just poetry. It is a description of a vanished landscape. Here is the reframe. When you hear tidal giant, it sounds like something out of mythology, a titan from an old legend. But the scientists chose that word for a cold, factual reason. When they studied the rock the creature was buried in, they found the fingerprints of an ancient shoreline, fossil mangrove plants, root systems. The exact kind of sediment that forms in tidal flats, the muddy zone where the sea meets the land and the water rises and falls twice a day. This giant did not live in a desert. It lived on a coast, a hot, wet, tropical coast, something like the Everglades of Florida, complete with tides washing in and out through the roots of coastal trees. 94 million years ago, the place we now call the Western Desert of Egypt was a green, dripping, humid shoreline on the edge of an ancient ocean. And it was not just one giant. The same rocks held fish, turtles, crocodile-like hunters, and evidence of not one, but multiple enormous meat eaters, 3 separate predators, roughly the size of the American tyrant king, all hunting in the same ecosystem. Smith said it plainly. They may have stumbled onto dinosaur heaven. To feed that many giant predators, the land had to be exploding with life, one of the most productive ecosystems the planet has ever seen. A jungle of monsters, right where the sand is now. And there is a detail in that lost swamp that scientists still cannot fully explain. When Stromer first studied his four dinosaurs a century ago, he noticed something that did not make sense. The place was crawling with giant meat eaters. But where were all the plant eaters they were supposed to be hunting? A healthy ecosystem is like a pyramid. You need a huge base of prey animals to support even a small number of top predators. But in the Bahariya rock, the predators seemed to outnumber the prey. Stromer wrote about it. He could not solve it. Paleontologists still call it Stromer's riddle to this day. How did a single stretch of coast feed three separate hunters the size of the Tyrant King, plus a sail-backed monster, all at once? Something about that ancient shoreline was strange in a way we still do not completely understand, and every fossil we pull out of it deepens the puzzle instead of solving it. The giant sail-backed predator itself only got stranger with time. For decades, all anyone had were Stromer's burned drawings. Then, in 2014, a new partial skeleton, recovered from the same band of rock that stretches across North Africa, forced scientists to completely redraw the animal. The bones showed short hind legs and dense, heavy bone tissue, the kind you see in animals that spend their lives in water. The largest predatory dinosaur ever found had not been a simple land hunter at all. It had been something closer to a monstrous river dweller, a swimming predator that ruled the ancient waterways of what is now the Sahara. The desert had been hiding not just a giant, but a giant that swam. And it took 100 years and a second set of bones to see it. And these were not isolated flukes. In 2018, another team working the Egyptian desert announced yet another new giant, a long-necked plant eater the size of a school bus, one of the most complete dinosaur skeletons ever found on mainland Africa from the final stretch of the age of dinosaurs. It filled in a gap scientists had been staring at for generations. It proved that Africa's last giants were not cut off from the rest of the world, that creatures could still move between this continent and Europe near the very end. Egypt, the country everyone had written off as a dinosaur dead zone, was quietly turning into one of the most important dinosaur frontiers on the planet. One bone at a time, one expedition at a time. Each one pulled from ground that most of the world still thinks of as nothing but pharaohs and sand. The mainstream reading of all this is straightforward and correct. Continents drift. Climates change. Seas rise and fall. A tropical coast turned into a desert over tens of millions of years, and the bones of its inhabitants were locked into stone. Nothing supernatural. Just deep time doing what deep time does. But that ordinary explanation hides something genuinely disturbing when you really let it land. It means the ground the pyramids stand on has been, at different points in its history, a deep ocean, a tidal swamp full of the largest predators the continent ever produced, and finally, a bone-dry desert. Three completely different worlds stacked on top of each other in the same place. And the pharaohs, for all their obsession with eternity and the afterlife and the deep past, built their monuments on top of a graveyard so old they could not possibly have comprehended it. They thought they were the ancient ones. They were standing on something 100 million years older. And here is the detail that makes the whole thing land. When they name the exact spot, when you map where these giants were pulled out of the ground, you are talking about the same broad region, the same country, the same desert system that surrounds the Nile and the pyramids. Not a different continent, not the far side of the world. Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, was also, tens of millions of years earlier, the land of the giants. Two impossible histories, stacked in the same soil. And that brings us to the strangest clue of all, the one that connects the ancient bones to human hands. Because here is a question that has never been fully answered. Did the ancient Egyptians ever find these fossils themselves? Think about it. These bones are not always buried deep. In the desert, Wind strips the sand away and leaves fossils sitting on the surface. Giant vertebrae, massive limb bones, teeth as long as a human hand. The ancient Egyptians walked this desert for thousands of years. They mined it, they quarried it, they crossed it in caravans. The idea that they never once stumbled onto a monstrous bone poking out of the sand strains belief. And there are hints. Across the ancient world, people who found the bones of dinosaurs and other prehistoric giants did not have the word fossil. They did not have the concept of extinction or deep time. So they explained the bones with the only framework they had. They called them the remains of dragons, of griffins, of monsters and gods and titans who fought before the age of men. Some researchers believe that the legends of enormous serpents and dragons that appear in so many ancient cultures may have started exactly this way, with real people finding real bones and reaching for the only explanation available to them. A giant skull with a single large nasal opening becomes a one-eyed monster. A row of huge fanged jaws becomes a dragon. And the bones are not the only impossible thing sticking out of that ground. Just outside modern Cairo, on the edge of the very desert that holds the pyramids, there is a place where entire trees have turned to stone. A petrified forest, whole trunks of ancient wood transformed into solid rock, lying scattered across the sand, like the wreckage of a world that drowned and dried and fossilized. Not far from there sits a valley so full of the skeletons of ancient whales that it earned the name Whale Valley, a stretch of desert where the bones of enormous sea mammals lie exposed on the surface. Animals that swam over this land back when it was still ocean. Petrified forests, stone whales, buried giants. This is the landscape the ancient Egyptians actually lived in. A desert that keeps coughing up the bones of impossible creatures and the remains of vanished worlds. So imagine you are an ancient person crossing that ground. You do not know what a fossil is. Nobody does. And you find a tree made of stone, or a skeleton the size of a house, or a jaw full of dagger teeth. What do you do with that? You build a story around it. Egypt was obsessed with the serpent, with monstrous coiling creatures of the underworld, with the great snake of chaos that the sun had to battle every single night beneath the earth. Nobody can prove that a fossil ever inspired those images. But stand in that desert. Imagine a priest or a quarry worker 4,000 years ago uncovering a set of jaws longer than his own body, teeth like daggers, a spine of bony blades, and ask yourself what he would have thought he had found. He would not have thought an extinct reptile from the Cretaceous period. He would have thought he had uncovered the bones of a god or a demon sleeping under the sand. They were not guessing. They were seeing something real. They just did not have the words for it. Now, I have to be honest with you, because this is where we separate what is solid from what is not. You may have seen a story floating around the internet claiming that archaeologists found actual dinosaur bones, and even wall paintings of dinosaurs, inside a hidden chamber deep within the Great Pyramid itself. It is a dramatic story. Dinosaur skeletons sealed in a secret room painted onto the walls by the pyramid builders, proof that the ancient Egyptians saw living dinosaurs. And I would love for it to be true. It is not. That specific claim traces back to a satirical article, a piece of fiction that got copied, stripped of its context, and passed around as real news until it took on a life of its own. There is no confirmed hidden chamber of dinosaur skeletons inside the Great Pyramid. There are no verified pyramid wall paintings of a velociraptor. So, does that mean the whole idea of dinosaurs beneath Giza is nonsense? Not even close. And this is the part that matters, because the fake story is far less impressive than the real one. You do not need a fictional secret chamber. The truth is stranger. The pyramids are literally built out of fossil-bearing rock, stacked with the shells of ancient sea creatures, and you can touch them. The desert around Cairo, genuinely holds the bones of some of the largest animals that ever lived. A real scientist really did discover a lost world of giants near the Nile, and that discovery really was destroyed in a wartime fire. And a second team really did go back and pull an 80-ton titan out of the same ground. Every one of those things is documented, published, and confirmed. The invented story is small. The real one is enormous. People reached for a fantasy because they never learned that the reality was already sitting right under the pyramids. So no, this is probably not proof that the pharaohs kept pet dinosaurs, or that a T-Rex is entombed under the Sphinx. The most extreme version of the story does not hold up. But that does not make the discovery ordinary. It makes it something better. It makes it real. Because here is what it actually means, and this is the thought I cannot shake. We think of the pyramids as the beginning of history, the oldest thing, the deepest past we can touch. 4,500 years old, so ancient that almost everything before them dissolves into myth. But the bones in the ground beneath them turn that idea inside out. The stone in the Great Pyramid is around 50 million years old. The giants, buried near the Nile, are closer to 100 million years old. Next to that, the entire span of human civilization, every pharaoh, every empire, every war, everything we have ever built and written and remembered, is a single thin layer at the very top of a stack that goes down and down and down into unimaginable depths of time. The pharaohs wanted to be eternal. They built the pyramids to last forever, to defeat death, to touch the deep past and the far future at once. And the cruel, beautiful irony is that they succeeded in a way they never intended. Their monuments really are made of eternity. They are made of the compressed bodies of creatures that lived and died 50 million years before the first human drew breath. Every block is a fragment of a vanished ocean. The whole structure is a tombstone for a world that had no name, no memory, and no witnesses. And most of that world is still down there. We have barely scratched it. The western desert of Egypt is vast, and it is one of the least explored fossil regions on the planet. Not because there is nothing to find, but because so few people have gone looking. Whole species almost certainly still lie under the sand, uncatalogued, unnamed, waiting the way Paralititan waited for 100 years after Stromer's giants burned. For every monster we have pulled out of that ground, there are likely others still sealed in the rock, in the dark, exactly where the tide left them 100 million years ago. So the next time you see a photograph of the Great Pyramid rising out of the desert, look past the monument. Look at the ground it stands on. That sand was an ocean. Before that, a swamp full of giants. The stone in those perfect blocks is made of the dead of a world so old the pharaohs could never have dreamed it. They built the greatest tomb in human history, and they built it, without ever knowing, on top of a far older grave. The giants are still there, under the sand, under the pyramids, waiting to be found. And almost nobody is digging. If this is the kind of buried history you want more of, the investigation continuing on screen right now goes even deeper. Watch it next.